Hi, BookTube. Welcome. This is part two of a three-part blog in which we will be looking at Rosamund Bartlett's biography of Leo Tolstoy. I had a comment from Meg from Books Off the Beaten Path, and I'm going to read out her comment. She was making it about part one of the vlog that aired just over a week ago, and she said, "Heather, I don't know what I would do without you. I will never read this book, but you took the time to educate me about this author." Well, I'm really pleased Meg said that, because in case anybody's concerned, the purpose of these vlogs is twofold. Firstly, longer nonfiction is costly. It's costly in terms of money. You can't just go to your library and expect every piece of nonfiction to be there. Libraries tend to do more fiction than nonfiction, and you may not have access to a university library where there might be more nonfiction. So you are left with this decision. If you do want to read, you're probably going to have to purchase the book, and that's going to be more expensive than buying other forms of books. But secondly, longer nonfiction just takes time to read. And so my hope is that, that these blogs give you enough information to make a purchasing decision if you do want to read the book, but they also give you time-saving insights into the subject so that you can learn something valuable regardless, whether you buy or whether you don't. Life is short, and we have to make these kinds of choices. Now, what I had intended, going along with my usual vlog format, was to give you chapter summaries of chapters 7 through 10. But what I found as I was reading this part of the book, this middle section, was that certain issues just carried on. They kept overlapping. There'd be a bit of issue 1, then issue 2, then back to issue 1, then issue 3, then back to issue 2, then 1, then 4. And I just thought, no, what would be better would be just to present you with these 4 topics. And they are Tolstoy's marriage, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and Tolstoy's greatest passion. And yes, it will come as a surprise to some of you, I think, to know that his greatest passion was not writing novels. Let's talk first about Tolstoy's married life. In September 1862, Tolstoy married Sonia Bears, and she was the daughter of the court physician to Tsar Nicholas I. She was only 18 when she married. Tolstoy was 34. Her life had been lived in a small apartment adjoining the Kremlin, and Moscow was a very busy, active city with a social life, as you can imagine any great capital would have, so she never spent very much time on her own. She loved going to the theater. Married life transferred her to Tolstoy's country estate, which was several miles from the nearest village, and there wasn't a rail line built to that village yet. So for the next 18 years, Sonia virtually never left the place. She gave birth to 13 children, of which 8 survived to adulthood. The first was born in 1864, and the last was born in 1888. Altogether 13 pregnancies in 22 years. I'm going to read an extract from pages 185 and 187 of this very heavy book, which I'm going to lift the camera. There we go. Okay, let's start reading. In August 1871, Sonia noted in her diary that something in their relationship had snapped the previous winter when they had both been unwell. Tolstoy also later referred to becoming aware of his loneliness after a string broke in their marriage at around this time in his diary. They had squabbled before, of course, but this rift was more serious and initially arose over their differing views of the woman's role in marriage. Even though Sonia continued to defer to her husband, she was becoming increasingly confident about asserting her own views, sometimes goaded by sheer physical necessity. In February 1871, Sonia gave birth to their second daughter and 5th child, who was christened Maria after Tolstoy's sister, and who, like her, immediately became known to everybody as Masha. After an extremely difficult delivery, Sonia contracted puerperal fever and nearly died, which understandably made her unwilling to endure the terror and pain of another bout of life-threatening illness. She began to think it would be best for her not to become pregnant again, but her husband had different ideas. Sonia was only 27 when Masha was born, so must have been filled with dread at the thought of complying with her husband's wishes. The intransigence of his views would lead her to having 8 more children, only 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Quite apart from the health risks, each new pregnancy bound her more tightly to Yasnaya Polyana and meant she had to postpone yet again her hopes of having a life outside the nursery. With every child you have to give up a life for yourself even more and resign yourself to the burden of cares, worries, illnesses, and years, she noted in her diary in June 1870. Sonia was a devoted mother, and she loved living at Yasnaya Polyana, but she was a young woman who had grown up in a city, and after a while she began to long for a change of scene, some company, and the chance to go to the occasional soiree. She found the solitude depressing. Now, Tolstoy's treatment of his wife was not untypical for Russia at the time, but it seems good to highlight this reminder of the harsh realities for 19th century women in Europe. Tolstoy could, and he did, leave Yasnaya Polyana many times during the period 1864 to 1888. He made several trips to Moscow to do research, but his wife, she didn't have the same freedom of movement. And you've probably heard or read how much Tolstoy relied on his wife to be his copy editor and to convert his scribbled, edited text into something readable for publishers. He picked the right woman for this. Sonia had been well educated, and she made numerous suggestions about additions or changes to her husband's manuscripts for War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And she was dissatisfied when he went on to work on material that was less intellectually satisfying for her, such as his books for children. She delegated some of that copying to a hired clerk. War and Peace, or as it was originally titled, The Year 1805. Yeah, not as catchy. I'm really glad he changed it. Tolstoy started writing War and Peace shortly after he married, and Rosamund Bartlett points out how the 1860s, when he decided to begin writing, it was the perfect time to start a work of historical fiction. The first public libraries in Moscow opened during this decade, and particularly important was the research library that was connected with the Rumyantsev Museum and the Chertkov Library. These provided Tolstoy with vital primary sources that hadn't been available to other people before. They came from private collections. Oh, and by the way, Tolstoy's idea, his second idea for a title for this novel was All's Well That Ends Well. And that's even worse, because that's drawing a comparison between one of Shakespeare's comedies and then this massive prose narrative with a scope unlike anything. It would have been comparing chalk and cheese. Rosamund Bartlett does give readers a potted history of Napoleon's march on Moscow to give everyone a background as to what Tolstoy was writing about in War and Peace, but it's not enough information to really capture the drama of this event and why War and Peace was therefore such a groundbreaking and broad-scoped book. And so I'm really glad that I read Adam Zamoyski's 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow. And if you're new to my channel, you'll see links in my description box to the 3 vlogs that I made about that book if you wanted to check those out. Anna Karenina, definitely Tolstoy's most popular novel, and as I mentioned in part 1 of this vlog, Rosamund Bartlett was commissioned to translate Anna Karenina for Oxford Classics edition, and that was the first new translation that publisher had commissioned since, I think it was 92 years before that. Rosamund's experience, however, bear this in mind if you do get the book, her experience weights the biography. She gives more detailed attention to Anna Karenina and its writing than she does to War and Peace. And the funny thing is, Tolstoy was the exact opposite. He had a conflict of interest when he came to start this novel, which meant that Anna Karenina took longer to write than War and Peace, and he was almost at a point of giving up finishing it altogether. I felt sorry for the editor of the Russian Messenger. This was the journal that had agreed a contract with Tolstoy to publish Anna Karenina in installments before it came out in book form. Readers, they had to wait ages. Between the first and second installment, I think they had to wait several months. But between installment 2 and installment 3, they had to wait 2 years. This is how difficult Tolstoy was finding it to keep his attention on his work. Now, it can be explained, yes, partly by personal difficulties. Sonia Tolstoy fell ill with peritonitis in 1875 while she was pregnant, and that made her go into labor prematurely, and it meant that she lost the second of the 5 children that she lost. And the aunt, the one who became guardian to all the Tolstoy boys back when they were teenagers, she died. And that was the last person that had linked Tolstoy in any way with his parents. So those events, and also the 1877 war that Russia had with the Ottoman Empire, which Tolstoy was violently opposed to, all these made his novel writing seem petty in his mind and stupid, and that's another powerful reason why Anna Karenina just became a chore for him to finish. Tolstoy wanted to use his creative energy differently, and this leads perfectly into talking about his interest in education. Education. It would probably upset Tolstoy if he could come back now and realize that outside of Russia, not many people realize that his greatest passion, the issue to which he gave more years of his life than he gave to writing novels, was the reform of children's education. We got to go back now to 1856, when Tolstoy had just taken up his estate in Yasnaya Polyana, and he was determined to act on the proclamation made the same year by Tsar Alexander II, which was intended to begin the process of freeing the serfs. Tolstoy found that his own serfs, they stubbornly resisted any changes that he wanted to make to their lives. They were suspicious of his offers, and after considering the problem, he concluded that lack of education was at the root of all this resistance and suspicion. And at the time, it makes sense, less than 6% of the rural population in Russia were literate, and there were no state schools in the countryside. So before he went off to fight in the Crimean War, Tolstoy started up an experimental school for the peasant children at Yasnaya Polyana. In 1859, he was able to reopen it, and later that same year, he left Russia and he took a 12-month journey around Europe, which I think I described in the last vlog. Only what I didn't say then was that the purpose of that journey was fact-finding. It was to learn how children were being educated elsewhere. And after his return, he was granted permission by the Russian Ministry of Education to start a journal. And when he was appointed Justice of the Peace in the district around his estate, he set up 21 more schools, which were operating along the lines of the one that was at Yasnaya Polyana. Now, Tolstoy's educational methods were pretty extraordinary for their time. His schools had a child-centered approach, which he describes in the first issue of the journal that he published. And I am going to read a quote from that journal on page 146 of the biography. No one brings anything with him, neither books nor copybooks. No homework is set to them. Not only do they carry nothing in their hands, they have nothing to carry even in their heads. They are not obliged to remember any lesson nor any of yesterday's work. They are not tormented by the thought of the impending lesson. They bring only themselves, their receptive nature, and an assurance that it will be as jolly in school today as it was yesterday. No one is ever scolded for being late. They sit where they like, on the benches, tables, windowsills, floor, or in the armchair. By the timetable, there should be 4 lessons before dinner, but sometimes in practice these become 3 or 2, and maybe on quite different subjects. In my opinion, this external disorder is useful and necessary, however strange and inconvenient it may seem to the teacher. First, this disorder, or free order, only frightens us because we were educated in and are accustomed to something quite different. Secondly, in this, as in many similar cases, coercion is only used from hastiness or lack of respect for human nature. The other landowners in his district, not to mention the Russian Ministry of the Interior, they took a dim view of Tolstoy's activities. They feared the schools would be breeding grounds for revolutionary activity. In July 1862, Tsarist secret police raided Yasnaya Polyana, and they conducted a 2-day search, and they were hoping to find seditious material in the schools. They found nothing, but that didn't stop them from arresting all the teachers, which effectively shut down that project. Tolstoy had to find somewhere else to direct his energies, and that became War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But the passion for education, it did not die. It just went quiet until, or almost until, those 2 novels were finished. In between the 2 novels, Tolstoy wrote an ABC book for children, and that's the central picture that you can see here, and a number of translations of folk tales and original stories he wrote himself aimed at a school children audience. And he restarted the school eventually that was based in his home. And that is part 2 of this vlog done. Part 3 will be up on YouTube about this time next week, actually, and that is when I can count this book as finished, and it will become number 52 of 53 in my Read What I Own challenge, which I never seem to stop talking about and probably won't until October and the challenge are finally done. Anyway, whatever you are reading right now, I wish you all the best. I hope you love it, and I will see everyone again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.